It's a great pleasure to be here, and really a tremendous privilege to speak at the Annenberg Space for Photography. So let me begin with the post-war consumer regime. And one of the big things that happened after the Second World War was the development of suburbs, homes like this, tract homes, developments like Levittown. And in the post-war planning, policymakers and economists were very concerned about the economy going back into depression. And I say it sounds kind of counterintuitive or even quaint today, because that situation has changed so much, because we've been sort of trained into becoming a nation of consumers in which sort of the idea that we have limited needs is pretty odd to us. We have what sociologists call naturalized insatiable desire, the idea that you can never have enough. Already back in the 1950s and 60s, you could see the beginnings of what was going to be a more expansive and certainly aesthetic, a more design-oriented consumer culture. You can sum it up in a sense in one word, and that word is, it's all relative. And it's all relative in the sense that, first of all, okay, there's that house. How are the people in that house feeling about it? How does it relate to their consumer aspirations, their sense of satisfaction or not? Are they dissatisfied? Are they satisfied? And back in the 1950s, what it depended on was who was living next door. That's why I show you this one first. If this family in this trailer moved in next door, the folks sitting in that suburban home were going to be feeling pretty good, because they were doing very well relative to what we call in the literature their reference group. Key point, consumption is very relative. In the post-war era, this is what the street looked like. It wasn't the trailer home, it wasn't the McMansion. It was rows of homes that were pretty much the same. So they were aspiring generally to a little bit more than what they had. And I've called this either proximate, meaning nearby emulation, or horizontal emulation, meaning people are comparing themselves with people who have roughly the same. And that's a kind of sustainable consumer culture. The idea is that if you're just aspiring for a little bit more than what you have, you can probably manage it. You can work a little bit harder. You can save up for something that you want, etc. Now that began to change. Here, by this measure, you see somewhere in the 1970s, the income distribution starts not to get more equal year by year, but to get more unequal. Since the 2000s, you can see it gets much steeper. And here we can see the other side of that, which is middle-class wealth. So this is the share of total U.S. wealth owned by the bottom 90% of families. It's at a low point in the 1930s when a lot of people got wiped out. But then that long period of what I referred to as building a middle class, and then that starts to turn around in the 1980s. So the bottom 90%, by the most recent estimates, are owning only about a little bit over 20% of all the wealth. What does conspicuous consumption do? It forces you to show the money. And the more money you can waste, the more you can show how wealthy you are. That's why things like handbags become so important. And I've done a lot of work on this, sort of looking at the things that people will spend a lot on versus the things that they won't. And one of the things you see is the sort of extent to which these goods are used in public is really key to how much people will spend. You can see it in apparel. People will pay the most for their outer coats, the least for the garments that aren't seen. That all changed. I used to use underwear as an example. That all changed when people started taking their clothes off in front of each other, and underwear became a designer. Social scientists did studies of people who watch television, and they found out that people who watch more television are much more likely to think that the average American has a swimming pool, that the average American has a maid. So they got really distorted sense of what was normal. And what I argued was we shifted to this period of vertical emulation, sort of upward emulation, in which the majority of people began looking far beyond what was close to them economically, but to lifestyles of the affluent and eventually the rich and the celebrities and athletes and so on and so forth, and began to aspire to much more wealth. So this is the actual distribution of wealth. The top 1%, by this most recent estimate, top 1% has 40% of the nation's wealth. So 1% has almost getting close to half of the nation's wealth. The top 20% has 93% of the nation's wealth. So this is all happening. It's getting worse and worse as the years go by. Beginning in the 1990s, something else starts happening, and this is another one of Lauren's photos, which I really love, and that is what we might think of as kind of the massification of hyperconsumerism. So it's not exactly the same thing as the wealth emulation. It's connected to it, though, and it has to do with the fact that there's all that pent-up consumer demand. And the thing that starts changing is a flow of cheap imports, cheap consumer imports into the country. So what's going on here? Well, the first thing I started to do was to track how much clothing were people really buying. Now, economists typically do that by looking at dollar values. So how much are people spending on clothes? That wasn't changing all that much, and the reason was that clothes were getting cheaper and cheaper, just like everything else. But here's the other really interesting thing. We're not just buying them, we're also discarding them. We have quickened the cycle. But this photo comes from a store near me, it's called the Garment District, that sells clothing by the pound. And at the time I took this picture, it sold clothing by the pound, $1.50 a pound, and $1 on Fridays. And actually, I called them up as I was preparing for this lecture to find out what the price was now. And they said, well, it's still the dollar. I said, but if you're a student, you can come and take 20 pounds of clothing free. And now here we get to the ecological part of things. What we call material extraction. So that's measures of how much materials, whether we're talking about fossil fuels, we're talking about biomass, we're talking about trees, all the material flows in the economy that we need to make all of these consumer goods, they're moving up with the GDP. Remember, some of the things we consume it's everything that it takes to make it. So to make a teensy little cell phone, lots and lots of materials, the same, a lot of the electronics are like that. So most of the material doesn't actually end up in the final good. There's a lot of material that's wasted. Think about mining. And this doesn't even include all what's called, the land they displace when they mine, the earth they displace when they mine. But the actual material flows associated with the final products are many, many times what it actually weighs. So, but even so, it's an enormous level of material consumption. The world average is 60 pounds, so we're at 178. So at this point, about 3 times the world average. And this is the concept of overshoot, the idea of using up more of the planet than we have. It's associated with the ecological footprint. But look at what has happened. Every year, Earth Overshoot Day gets earlier and earlier. And in 2006, Earth Overshoot Day was on August 8th. So every day after August 8th, we are using up more. We are eating into the natural capital of the Earth, and that is undermining our planetary reproduction. Thank you.